How does the Netherlands connect to China's military? Well, let me begin with probably your most famous virologist. The title of my presentation is also my scientific opinion, that COVID-19 was made in a laboratory as part of China's biowarfare program. Now, I will ask a number of common questions and try to give you answers to those questions in a simple way, scientifically. From the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese Communist Party has insisted that this was a natural transmission from animals to humans in the Wuhan market. Now, the scientific evidence really doesn't support that, and it supports the opposite conclusion, that it came from a laboratory, and I'll show you that. So this is what they've been saying from the beginning, that it's a natural transmission from animals to humans in the Wuhan market. But if you actually look at the data, there are no infected animals in the Wuhan market. They took samples from the Wuhan market and found no infected animals. In fact, they tested over 100 marketplaces in China, 80,000 samples, and none of the animals were infected with COVID-19. Now, of the human sources, samples that they took in the Wuhan market, none of these samples showed the earliest form of COVID-19, the earliest strain. So that tells you, at least initially, that it must have come from somewhere else, not the Wuhan market. Also, some of the early patients had not even visited the market. So where did they get the disease? So I think many scientists are concluding that the Wuhan market was actually a later super spreader event. Now, if it did not occur naturally, it must have leaked or been deliberately released. So where did this happen? Now, if you look at the heat, what we call the heat maps, where the density of COVID-19 patients were in the early stages of the disease, it was actually on the other side of the Yangtze River. Up in this corner here, it's out of the picture, but the Wuhan market is up here somewhere. But the epicenter of the disease in the early stages took place in what is called the Wuchang district of Wuhan. Now, I suppose not coincidentally, there were 3 places in this area, shown in the stars here, that were doing coronavirus research at the time. There's the Wuhan University non-human primate testing facility. They tested monkeys there. Just below that, there was the Wuhan Institute of Virology facility at this particular location. And at the bottom, there was the People's Liberation Army Hospital, which was also doing coronavirus research at that time. So, why were they doing these kinds of potentially very, risky, dangerous experiments with these potentially dangerous viruses? Now, the explanation almost everyone gives you is that, well, we were doing these risky experiments because of humanitarian reasons, that you could predict the next jump from animals to humans by doing these types of studies, and therefore, prepare vaccines or other therapeutics to treat them. But there are no cases in which these types of experiments have either predicted or prevented disease. In fact, it's very likely that it caused the COVID-19 pandemic. So you look for the real reasons. Now, there's an incentive for scientists to do these type of studies because it's called cutting edge, these type of genetic engineering experiments. So scientists like to be on the cutting edge, so they do. They want to get more grants, they want to publish more papers, they want to get promoted. So there's a scientific incentive to do this. But the really dark reason here is biological warfare, biowarfare. Now, the problem with these types of experiments, these genetic engineering experiments, it is it is often difficult, to tell the difference between experiments that are for humanitarian reasons and experiments that are for biowarfare. Now, I want to go next to China's military doctrine about biowarfare. And I'd like to introduce you to Colonel Guo. Colonel Guo is a military strategist, People's Liberation Army, 3rd Military Medical University. Now, remember 3rd Military Medical University, because I'll come back to that later. Now, Colonel Guo and his colleagues have done most of the recent papers and doctrine on Chinese biowarfare. And it began just after the first coronavirus pandemic in 2002 and 2004. And they started talking about a concept called biotechnology weapons. Now, I put this in white bold because this is exactly what they say, because I've read these Chinese military documents. Now, their idea about these biotechnology weapons is that they can be used under what they call pre-war conditions. Would be highly contagious but non-lethal, and would have what they call plausible deniability. That is, their use can be concealed or denied. For example, it can be blamed on nature. Now, this sounds to me very much like COVID-19, and this was written, years before the outbreak. Another individual I would like to introduce you to is Major General Wu Chun-Chao. He is a high-ranking PLA officer, and he's the People's Liberation Army chief of the People's Liberation Army Center for Disease Control. I also want you to remember this guy too, because I'll talk about him a bit later. Now, we don't have to read through this. I can tell you what this says. What Major General Cao says in this case is that we would take the old biological weapons, or the traditional biological weapons, and use genetic engineering to make them more dangerous. Basically, that's what he's saying here. And this type of technique is called gain-of-function research. Now, what are the types of gain-of-function characteristics indicating, laboratory manipulation? Let me define what this is easily for you. Gain-of-function research is artificially changing viruses in the laboratory to give them properties that they do not have in nature. So it's deliberate. And what are the types of gain-of-function characteristics do you see? You can change a virus to allow it to jump from animal to animal or from animal to human. You can change the virus to make it more transmissible, more infectious. You can change a virus to make it more dangerous and deadly. You can also make the virus more difficult to detect or identify it as a biowarfare agent. And you can give the virus the ability to evade the human immune response. Now, COVID-19 has all 5 of those gain-of-function characteristics. So what is the evidence for the laboratory origin of COVID-19? Now, this may look a little complicated, but I'll explain it to you. The smoking gun, in this case, is a structure in COVID-19 called the furin polybasic cleavage site. And this is shown right here, PRRA. Now, as you can see in this comparison, this is COVID-19 at the top, which has the PRRA sequence, amino acid sequence. You can see that it does not exist in any of the close relatives of COVID-19. And I could show you maybe 100 other examples where it doesn't exist in other coronaviruses compared to it existing in COVID-19. So the point of this is there's really no evolutionary pathway that could have naturally produced this kind of outcome. And we've known for 20 years that furin polybasic cleavage sites increase the ability of coronavirus to cause infection, and they become more deadly if you add this particular structure to a coronavirus. And since the first SARS, the first coronavirus pandemic in 2002 and 2004, the People's Liberation Army have been studying this type of structure and the effects of this type of structure. And in 2013, a PLA scientist artificially inserted this. And these are all publications that are readily available. Now, one thing I want to also talk about is, what's been happening that is very dangerous, that occurred even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to show you one particular article from 2015. Now, this is a gain-of-function MERS study. MERS is another coronavirus which caused the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome in 2012. And this went from bats to camels to people. This particular virus killed 30% of the people exposed to it, compared to 1% or less than 1% for COVID-19. And what these guys did, there are some People's Liberation Army scientists in the list here. Shibu Zhang is one of them. Zhengli Shi is the Batwoman from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But what they did here was they found a bat coronavirus from nature. Now, this bat coronavirus didn't infect humans, and they genetically engineered it to infect humans. That was this study. Now, you can imagine if this one leaked, which causes 30% fatalities in the people that are infected with this particular virus. Now, let me just mention quickly other things that are in COVID-19 which point to the fact that it came from the laboratory. It is pre-adapted to human infection. In other words, COVID-19, for example, is 15 times more infectious than the original coronavirus pandemic in 2002 and 2004. And you can actually do this in the laboratory. What you do is, and it's been done in China since 2007, what you do is you genetically engineer a mouse. So the mouse has the human receptors for coronaviruses. And then you simply keep reinfecting these mice with whatever coronavirus you want to put in there, and it eventually becomes adapted to infect humans. So you can run it through between 5 and 15 times, get a coronavirus that doesn't infect humans, and then it's able to infect humans. So this is a laboratory technique to do that. COVID-19 has what are called super antigens. These cause inflammation, especially in the lungs, and it's the inflammation in the lungs that kill people because you can't get oxygen, from the outside through your lungs into your body. And it's a process called cytokine storm. So this is a capability within COVID-19. There's also a structure called ORF8. This is open reading frame 8. It blocks interferon. Interferon is a substance in your body which actually helps lower inflammation and also stimulates the immune system. So what's happening here is you have something in COVID-19 that increases inflammation. At the same time, you have a structure that doesn't allow the body to decrease inflammation. So it's like it's a double whammy, as we say. Now, if that's not bad enough, let me show you this. This is a research grant application, 2018, 2 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. It was sent to the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, which is part of the U.S. Defense Department. Now, this grant has some of the key people who have done coronavirus research for a number of years, including gain of function, including these dangerous experiments. Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina, Peter Daszak from the EcoHealth Alliance in New York, Lin Fa Wang from the University of Singapore, and again, the bat lady Zhengli Shi from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I can tell, I've read this. This research application reads like a recipe for creating COVID-19. I'm not kidding. Including inserting a furin cleavage site in the same site that it eventually appears, in the same position that it eventually appears in COVID-19. Actually, the US Defense Department rejected this application, and the reason they rejected it is because they said it's too dangerous. So what happened, we believe, is that these experiments were farmed out to China, in particular the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, I think it's important to explain China's biowarfare program. It occurs at 3 levels. The first level of China's biowarfare program is the core secret level of the People's Liberation Army research centers and hospitals. Now, layered on top of that are all of Chinese universities, all the civilian research centers like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and all the biotechnology companies. Now, there's no difference between military and civilian research in China, and that's not me saying that. That was actually mandated by the Chinese Communist Party in the 13th five-year plan in 2016. They mandated this fusion of military and civilian. Now, the third level is our international universities and research centers, and I'll show you that it is the second level. I'm sorry. How do I make this go back? Okay, it's this second level of Chinese universities and civilian research centers and biotechnology companies that allows the first level, the military level, to access the third level. Since the 1990s, there's been a flood of Chinese scientists going abroad, in particular in the United States. Now, some of these Chinese scientists, including People's Liberation Army scientists, would come to the United States, gather knowledge, skills, and technologies, and bring them back to China. There are other Chinese scientists, including People's Liberation Army scientists, who would go to the United States and stay. They would become permanent residents, they would become citizens, they would act as anchors for other Chinese scientists to come over and be in their laboratories and do more of the same thing. Now, this is a big problem in the United States. But before I came to this meeting, I decided to look at the Netherlands and see what's going on in the Netherlands. Now, what I'm going to show you in the next few slides are facts. They're simple facts, and you can draw your own conclusions from the facts that I provide. So how does the Netherlands connect to China's military? Well, let me begin with probably your most famous virologist. Yeah, Dr. Marion Koopmans has worked for a long time with Chinese scientists. She has an extensive experience working with them. Of course, she's also working with the World Health Organization and was actually on the committee studying the origin of COVID-19. Now, Dr. Koopmans works with Gao Fu, or also known as George F. Gao. Now, George F. Gao is the head of China's Centers for Disease Control. Now, you probably say, well, that sounds harmless, doesn't it? It sounds like it might be okay. But George F. Gao has a long history of working with the China's People's Liberation Army. And some of these guys, like these are two major generals. One is the Veterinary Institute, and the other is the Academy of Military Medical Sciences in Beijing. So they're a high-level biowarfare program generals. These two are major directors of research institutes and programs. I'd just like to point out, I mentioned earlier about the third military medical university. He's there. Changjung Wang led a team of scientists isolating a bat coronavirus that many believe is the backbone of COVID-19. Now, Dr. Koopmans also works with a fellow named Ming Lau, He works at a agricultural university in Guangzhou. Now again, people say, well, that sounds relatively harmless. But people don't realize that the agricultural and veterinary programs in China are intimate elements in their biowarfare program. So this guy works with them. The guy in the middle is the head of the military veterinary research in China. And I'd just like to mention this guy on the right because he does something that's both interesting and important if you study these things. Chang Li is a military officer, obviously, but he shows himself on publications of being in a university. So people don't know when they're dealing with him that he's not actually in a university, he's actually working for China's military. And this happens a lot. I have trouble tracking a lot of these publications and these people because they change their associations. They also change the name of institutions in China. For example, there's a Chinese university now called Southern University. It's actually the first military medical university also in Guangzhou. Okay, let's go to Erasmus University. There's a scientist named Kuiwei Pang. He was trained in China, but he's now become a permanent member of the faculty at Erasmus University in the Department of Gastroenterology and Hepatology. Now, I've tracked at least 5 PhD students that work with him at Erasmus, People's Liberation Army scientists trained by him at Erasmus. There may be more. He also works with the 5th Medical Center, PLA Hospital in Beijing, again, the 3rd military medical university in Chongqing. He works with the PLA Hospital 302. This is a very, very important hospital for the People's Liberation Army. And he also continues to collaborate with his alma mater, which is Northwest Minzu University, and Kunming University of Science and Technology in Yunnan. A lot of the bat coronaviruses that they work on come from Yunnan. Now I'm going to end up my talk with showing you, this is my last slide, and if I pronounce this correctly, don't laugh too much, Wageningen University. They have an ongoing partnership with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and it started about the same time that Dr. Hu here got our PhD in 1998 from Wageningen University. This little logo here is People's Liberation Army, which means that Dr. Hu works with the People's Liberation Army. But it's not just her, there was a whole string of them going to Wageningen University and getting their PhDs. At least 3 of them are listed here. Also, there was a woman who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who was on staff at Wageningen University. This guy in the middle was actually director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So one of your university actually trained a lot of scientists at Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, we come back to this guy I told you about, Major General Wu Chun-Kao. He got his doctoral degree in 1997 from Erasmus. And out of that, there was a huge program between them, such that 37 scientific publications between 2005 and 2020 with the Academy of Military Medical Sciences and 8 other PLA research centers were done between Erasmus University and the People's Liberation Army. And he was the one who started all this. There were also others. Up here is another chief of the Academy of Military Medical Sciences in Beijing. He was in this program. There was a PLA scientist who was on staff at Erasmus in 2019. And I just like to end with this woman here, and I'll show you a little short video about her. She was in this program with Erasmus, and she is a rising star in the People's Liberation Army, in particular their biowarfare program. And what is interesting about this is these 2 groups actually ended up working together on coronaviruses. So I'd like to tell you where your tax money is going to by showing this video. It was produced last month by the Chinese Communist Party with her example, Wei Lu. And here it is.
刘伟长期从事重大、新发、突发传染病防控研究，通过10余年的持续攻关，在新病原体的发现溯源、监测预警与防治策略等方面取得系列研究成果，为满足国家传染病防控和生物安全防御的重大需求发挥了重要支撑作用。
时代赋予我们光荣的使命，我们将不忘初心，奋勇向前。
So let me end now where I started. It's my scientific opinion that COVID-19 was made in a laboratory as part of China's biowarfare program. And if we do not hold China accountable for the 2019 pandemic, we're likely to face another, possibly more dangerous pandemic and the proliferation of biological weapons from China to the world. So, dank u wel.